Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Dave Bartos. I'm the coordinator of adult services here at the Cranston Public Library. And I'd just like to welcome you all to this evening's program, which is The Freedom to Read, Challenges to Intellectual Freedom, Then and Now. And I'd like to welcome also the audience watching at home through the live stream. Hi. So we are broadcasting live to YouTube. If you want to listen back or watch back to anything, it'll be there for you. All right, so I will introduce everybody in a moment. I had a few brief announcements. This event is presented in partnership with the Sandra Bornstein Holocaust Education Center, and I'd like to thank Giovanna Weisman for working with me to put this event together. Really appreciate your efforts. Thank you. That's a good spot for it. Thank you so much. Would love it if everyone could silence their cell phones during the presentation. I'm just listening to my own advice. And the restrooms are right outside the door on the left. The best way to stay in the loop about all our events, both here and at the Sandra Bornstein Holocaust Education Center, is by signing up for our newsletter, and we've got signups on the table in the back. There's also a pledge from the Freedom Rhode Island Committee, which is an advocacy group that's standing up in the state against book bans and soft censorship. There's also a QR code you can scan to learn more about the group, how you can get involved. There are also cookies back there, so grab a cookie, check out all that other stuff. So this is Banned Books Week. That's an ALA, Unite Against Book Bans event that's just to bring awareness to what's going on. And if you haven't noticed, intellectual freedom, challenges to intellectual freedom have risen sharply over the past few years. The ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom released preliminary data for January through August of 2023, and they've documented 695 attempts to censor library materials, with 49% of these challenges happening at public libraries. And there's also been challenges to 1,915 unique titles, which is a 20% increase over the same period last year. And the year, which 2022 is the year that has the highest number of book challenges since ALA began compiling this data 20 years ago. This surge is about more than just the books, though. It's a coordinated effort, a coordinated threat to intellectual freedom that's coming from an activist political movement that seeks to mandate not just what people can read, but who gets to participate fully in our society. So in short, I believe that it starts with the books and with libraries, but we can learn from history that it doesn't necessarily stop there. So tonight's panel, our goal is to examine the events of the present in that historical context and to urge everyone here today and watching online advocate for the libraries that you love, that seek only to stock their shelves with something that will affirm everyone in their community, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, sexual orientation, actual or perceived gender identity or expression, disability, age, national or ethnic origin, or socioeconomic status. So before we invite our panelists up, I'd like to turn the podium over to Michael Goldberg. He's a library trustee with some opening remarks that will further bring together the past with our present. Thank you.
Thank you to librarians in general, and three in particular, Ed Garcia, the director of the Cranston Public Library, Dave Bartos, who you just heard, and to my daughter Joanna, who found and taught me how to find much of the information that informed my talk. Everyone doing the research needs a librarian. I'm here tonight because of this fuzzy photograph. Among the men posing, I recognize two: my paternal grandfather, Joseph Goldberg, on the far right, and Albert Einstein, just right of center. My grandfather died when I was 18 months old. As a teen, my grandmother told me how special he was, but self-centered teenagers don't care about dead ancestors. When my father died 15 years ago, I found this photograph in his files and started to read to learn more. Joseph served as the administrative director of the Brooklyn Jewish Center from its founding in 1919 till his death in 1954. The BJC, the shul with a pool, was a part of the American movement to replace the tiny village synagogues that served as the center of life for Eastern European Jews with a new American model. In April 1934, the Brooklyn Jewish Center Review called for establishing a library in the United States to be housed temporarily at the Brooklyn Jewish Center. A year earlier, the Nazi Party in Germany cleansed indecent, un-German books from bookstores and public and private libraries, culminating in a mass book burning in Berlin's Opera Square on May 10, 1933. In response, the burned book library was founded in Paris, inspiring the Brooklyn Jewish Center to open an American library of Nazi-banned books. The purpose of such libraries of the banned are obvious, the BJC Review editorial stated. They are to preserve in readily accessible collections all books which the Nazis outlawed in Germany. They are to preserve these cultural contributions to the world and at the same time remain monuments both to the men and women who created them and to the barbarity of those who, with medieval fanaticism, burned them. The center archives include copies of letters my grandfather wrote to Supreme Court justices, governors, senators, writers, activists, and other notables, asking them to join the Library Advisory Board. Through his efforts, Joseph successfully recruited Albert Einstein, Will Durant, Upton Sinclair, Theodore Dreiser, Sholem Asch, and others to advise the creation of the library. The BJC Review estimated books by between 300 and 400 authors were burned in Berlin, although the Nazis never published a list, and authors burned in one place were preserved in others. My grandfather wrote of the difficulty obtaining a list of the purged authors. The BJC worked with the Paris Library and the German Jewish publication Yiddische Rundschau to compile the only list of banned items then available in the United States, a list in demand by libraries, students, and writers. The library opened November 15, 1934, the photo taken at a gala dinner on December 22nd. In his speech at the opening gala, Einstein hailed this establishment of a library which had snatched from oblivion those literary products which were banned only because of their high human qualities. The Brooklyn Public Library archivist reports a small collection at the time of the dinner grew to some 500 titles by the outbreak of World War II. Although mostly forgotten today, the library was a big deal in 1934. Greetings arrived from many unable to attend, including Bertrand Russell, André Gide, and John Hayes Holmes, a founder of the ACLU. The dinner was widely covered in Brooklyn newspapers. The Jewish Daily Bulletin issued a special edition devoted to the dinner and the library. The ACLU blog Today in Civil Liberties History marks the November opening date, noting the library established on this day was one of the relatively few organized anti-Nazi protests in the U.S. This may sound like ancient history, but as Dave just mentioned, it's an ongoing issue today. This year, 6 members of the Rhode Island House of Representatives submitted House Bill H. 6324 to make the state legislative library, public, and charter school libraries criminally liable for distributing indecent material to minors, with potential fines and prison terms for librarians. I remembered this picture, and at Ed's urging, wrote an essay published in the Cranston Herald and the Warwick Beacon on the 90th anniversary of the Berlin book burning, pleading for the defeat of the bill. House leadership expects the bill won't come out of committee. Still, every week, if not every day, we hear about efforts across the country to ban or restrict access to books deemed grooming or obscene, or whose discussion of this country's history of race relation might upset some students. In the mid-1970s, the Brooklyn Jewish Center closed. The building is now a Hasidic religious school, and when my other daughter Sarah took a tour, the pool was still there. The library, however, is not. Along with the BJC archives, it moved to the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, yet in 1979, someone opened an office safe and found one item by a banned author left behind. Albert Einstein's original manuscript on unified field theory. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Michael. So now I would like to welcome our panelists up to continue the discussion. So please join me in welcoming Brigitte Hopkins and Bill Lancellotta from the Westerly Library, Stephen Brown, Executive Director of the Rhode Island ACLU, and Michael Bryant, Professor of History and Legal Studies at Bryant University. I love how you all stood up as I said your names. Sorry, that's not in my notes. And then lastly, our moderator, Tayla Cardillo, who is the chair of the Rhode Island Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. Thank you.
If I'm in the middle, is it going to mess it up?
No, I can just move.
Okay.
I didn't get a chance to tell you, but yeah.
All right. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes. Great. Awesome. So I thought that we would start at the beginning with some definitions so that we all know what we're talking about. So I thought I would present to our panel, what is a book ban or challenge, and why have we been seeing more coverage of censorship in the news lately? Why don't we start with our library perspective?
So what is a book ban or challenge? I think it's anything that someone tries to stop someone from reading or having access to. I think a challenge starts out verbal and then sometimes progresses. I know libraries have put in a lot of steps to put in official challenges to materials, and some people, when they ask about a material, if we have a discussion with them, that usually answers the question, but sometimes it doesn't, and paperwork needs to be filled out. And generally, librarians select books. We're trained to select materials for our community members, and there is a process. And so when a book is challenged, it often is not considered to be removed because there's already been a process in acquiring that material. But we still go through and review what we've already done, and we'll submit our answer. I think banning is actually feeling like it's okay to remove materials from libraries that have already been selected for the primary audience that has been selected for, school libraries. You can jump in here, Bill, but because I can ramble on about this. But really, the book banning, I'm glad we're not seeing it here. We're seeing a number of challenges, which is really disheartening. That because libraries don't try to impose their viewpoints upon others. We supply information so people can make their own decisions. And we would never ask a patron to, we would never make a decision for a patron about what material is right for them. That's their choice. And I think that we are respectful of even those who do challenge materials, who do want to ban books, because everyone has their own rights to think what they think.
I think historically we've had people coming to us, and if they challenge a book, it's out of a very honest reaction to something that has disturbed them. I think there's been a change in that, though. This seems to be obviously a coordinated political activism on certain groups' parts across the country that are, and it's not coming from that honest, I don't know if this is appropriate for, a public library or a school, and more about silencing certain voices, particularly LGBTQ community and people of color and their stories and the history that, as somebody has already said, might make someone else feel uncomfortable, which is an argument I personally have never understood. I can't remember a single time when I was growing up and learning about the Holocaust or slavery and thinking, oh my God, I caused that. That's my fault. So I don't know where that argument actually comes from, but my
And Stephen, do you have anything to add from the ACLU's perspective about the increase in coverage about censorship that we're seeing in the news?
I think we are seeing a lot more, but I think we're seeing a lot more coverage because there's a lot more censorship going on across the country. The ALA, which has been monitoring this, some of the statistics were cited by Dave about how many books are being challenged or banned across the country. And as Bill said, unlike I think a lot of times in the past, it is a coordinated national campaign that has made it such a huge issue and one that we simply cannot ignore at this time. And while it's true that we aren't in Rhode Island dealing with too many of those bans at this point, I'm concerned that the challenges are being filed, and to a large extent, the challenges are not necessarily to actually get the books banned, but to create an atmosphere of intimidation against librarians, make them think twice before ordering books that might be controversial. And I think that's one of the most dangerous things about what's going on, not just nationally, but also here in Rhode Island.
I definitely agree, and I think you're talking about the intimidation factor leads to more what we call soft censorship or self-censorship of librarians feeling afraid, especially if they live in more conservative communities, hesitating to buy different books and kind of stopping themselves from buying certain books, which is, I think, ultimately a disservice to their community. And it's unfortunate that they feel so intimidated by the current political climate. So as has already been alluded to in this presentation, there's a lot that we can learn from history. So Professor Bryant, if you could start off by giving us some background on book banning under the Nazis, who was affected, and how did book banning reflect Nazi ideology and goals?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. I think it's helpful in responding to that question to try to place this within an historical context, because what the Nazis were involved in, of course, was book burning. And book bans and book burning, I think, are very, very close cousins. Book burning typically has to do with a public spectacle, with carrying out actual destruction of books in a public forum and doing so in a ritualized way in order to draw attention to what's being done. And typically this is motivated by some sort of political, sometimes religious animus, which looks at the books in question as being objectionable. And I'll talk about specific applications of that here in just a moment. But I see book burnings as being, at least phenomenologically, just in terms of the basic facts of the book burning, they're different than book bans, because the book ban oftentimes, and I'll turn to our friends from the library and from the ACLU here, but from what I can gather, book bans typically take place within a much more furtive, much more secretive sort of environment, right? I mean, this is not a public ritual, a public spectacle, but instead, steps are taken to try to remove the books, perhaps under cover of night, I don't know, but certainly to do so in a very understated way. You don't find that public spectacle aspect of it that you do with book burnings. And yet, I think functionally, the two events have the same objective, the same goal, which is to choke off people's access to the books, to prevent people from reading the books or having access to the ideas expressed in the books. Now, everybody in this room, without a doubt, has heard of Nazi book burnings. So I want to talk for a moment about that. Do I have a little bit of time? I don't want to hog the stage here, but this is a complex history, and I'd be happy to have other people in the audience perhaps talk about it as well. But the Nazis were notorious for book burnings. The first book burnings, as we've already heard, the first book burnings date back to the spring of 1933. And interestingly enough, they were not carried out by the Nazi government. I'm chagrined to say, as an educator, a college professor myself, I'm chagrined to say that it was carried out by students, and oftentimes with the egging on from their professors. The German Student Association, the Confederation of, I have some feedback going on. You can hear me okay? This is a confederation of university students who announce in April of 1933 that they're going to conduct a nationwide book burning across all of Germany. And at the same time, they published their 12 theses, as they were called. It was supposed to evoke memories of Luther, Martin Luther, and his burning of a papal bull in 1517 when he posted his 95 theses on the door of the Wittenberg church. And the students were trying to sort of conjure the spirit, I think, of Luther, who of course just burned a single papal bull. He didn't burn all of the papal bulls, but just a single one. But nonetheless, this was supposed to evoke the memory of that. And according to the 12 theses, the students were demanding a purification of German culture and German literature and German language in order to make it fully German, to get rid of any traces of un-German sentiment, and in particular to purify it of its Jewish traces. So the students clearly were affected by Nazi ideology, even though they were not at the time a government office or an official extension of the Nazi Party. Nonetheless, they very clearly were acting within the spirit of the Nazis and their ideology. I wanted to mention, too, that just a few days before the official book burning, which was supposed to take place on May 10th of 1933, just a few days before in Berlin, there was an attack orchestrated by the Berlin chapter of the German Student Association. This Berlin chapter attacked the Institute for Sex Research, administered by Magnus Hirschfeld, and attacked it and ransacked it. Seized the books of the Institute for Sex Research and dragged them away. They would eventually take them to the Babelplatz and the Staatsoper, the State Opera in downtown Berlin. And on May 10th, they would incinerate these books, which were books devoted to transgender issues. The Institute for Sex Research actually did sex reassignment surgery. It was one of the first places to do this. It's rumored that the first transgender woman to have undergone this surgery at the Institute was actually killed in the course of this attack by the German students on May 6th. And there are all kinds of efforts to try to compare contemporary efforts to ban books to what the Nazis were doing. I'm sometimes very leery of these kinds of comparisons. I try to keep my powder dry when it comes to drawing comparisons between the Nazis and stuff that's going on in our own culture. But I do think that this particular aspect of the Nazi program does resemble efforts to attack and to subvert information about transgender people, LGBTQ persons. I think that there's a direct analogy that can be drawn there. So on May 10th, then, throughout the country, this wave of book burnings take place. Well, what kinds of books were burned on May 10th of 1933? Really anything that could be construed as being anti-German, un-German, undeutsch, right? Un-German books. So we have books written by foreigners who supposedly denigrated the new Germany, as the Nazis called it, the Germany of Hitler. books by Romain Rolland and H.G. Wells, the literature of Marxism, anything written by Marxists, communists, Bolsheviks was subject to being burned. Pacifist literature, the Nazis, after the Jews, probably hated the pacifists more than anybody else. Just read Mein Kampf sometimes. So much of Mein Kampf is dedicated, in addition to diatribes against the Jews, to fulminations against pacifists. So their literature was burned. Literature that had any kind of liberal or democratic tendency, or that defended democracy, and in particular the Weimar democracy. Anybody who published works trying to defend the Weimar Republic was liable to having those books burned. Books that advocated so-called degenerate art, so art that the Nazis disapproved of, the works of Georg Grosch and Otto Diess and the Bauhaus and other movements that the Nazis disapproved of, were consigned to the fire. Writings on sexuality, I just mentioned the attacks on Hirschfeld's Institute for Sex Research in Berlin. So any kind of writing that was perceived as being perverted or not fitting in with the Nazi concept of healthy sexuality, again, would be thrown into the bonfire. And of course, books by Jews. And if you were a Jewish author, it didn't matter what you were writing on. The mere fact that you wrote a book as a Jewish author was enough then for your book to be thrown into the fire. I want to make one more comment because I've probably talked longer than I should have, but this is such a loaded subject, and the history here is so important. There were additional book burnings that went on even after the spring of 1933, and I'm going to focus just for a second on the Eastern Territories after the invasion of Poland. We don't oftentimes think of this in the context of book burnings, but in fact, the Nazis, when they moved into the East, specifically into Poland, began to seize books by Poles and for Poles in public libraries as well as in scientific institutes, and they began to destroy those books. It's estimated that some 80% of all public libraries in Poland were destroyed by the Nazis in deliberate acts of vandalism, and some 75% of all scientific libraries were destroyed as well. These were deliberate efforts by the Nazis to destroy Polish culture. And I would argue this was an act of genocide. It was not biological genocide in this case, but was an act of trying to destroy Polish culture by getting rid of their books.
Thank you so much. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Hirschfeld and the Institute of Sex Research, because I think when people learn about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, they learn a lot about all of the Jewish culture and Jewish people and Jewish history that we lost. But I think even people within the queer community don't know about the history and the knowledge that we lost when that attack took place.
Maybe as many as 20,000 books, some of which were unique at the time.
Well, I think after your statements, the answer to this next question will be pretty clear, but I think it's important for us to hit on anyway, which is, and this is a question for all of our panelists. Am I on? Okay, I am on. This is a question for all of our panelists, which is, how do the ideas of freedom to read and freedom of expression uphold our democratic ideals? I don't know if we want to go librarians again and then.
Good. Works for me.
I'll be glad to briefly. I'll start. I think a democracy is premised on an informed citizenry, and it's hard to have an informed citizenry if the government is telling you that there are certain ideas that you can't read about, that you can't think about. That is the basic underpinning of a democratic society, to be able to think, speak freely without fear. And censorship is precisely the opposite, and it's anti-democratic to its core.
I couldn't agree more. And I would just really emphasize how essential access to knowledge, access to ideas, access to books is to a democratic culture, and specifically to a pluralistic culture. The oxygen of democracy is the exchange of ideas. I mean, the whole concept of parliament. Of course, we don't have a parliament as such, but we certainly have a parliamentary sort of system, a legislative system, a democratic system. And the basis to the word parliament is parler, which is to talk. And so you have to be able to get together and either in person or through literature, through books, you have to be able to exchange ideas so that decisions about policies can be made. And unless we're going to shoot our way to a solution, the only other alternative, it seems to me, is to talk our way towards a solution. And you can only have this through the free exchange of ideas. To me, it's a no-brainer.
It's funny you mentioned people being able to talk to each other, and I don't think it's it would be surprising for everyone in this political climate that a Speaker of the House was just removed because he negotiated with another party, which is, to avoid a government shutdown. I think it's just so important that everyone have as many options as possible when they go to a library. Yes, you're going to see things you don't like. There are things in my library I don't like. Authors who I'm disgusted by their views and ideas, but I would never ever think of depriving someone who wanted to read that material from doing it, deciding that for themselves and doing so.
I don't think there's much more to say except that the freedom to read, intellectual freedom, that's, all libraries and librarians uphold as part of, their values, it's the thing that drives us. It's the intellectual freedom is what we consider pretty much in everything that we do, from programs that we offer, materials that we purchase, and the community that we serve. I mean, it is essential to us and public libraries and democracy. So the idea of trying to squash that, is what we're seeing today, what we've seen over the decades, and unfortunately, I think we're seeing it more also because media coverage, is just everywhere. And so those ideas are being spread and misinformation is being spread.
I think the role of social media is important too. A lot of these movements are getting organized on social media, and these lists of hundreds of titles are being shared on social media so that people who, once it happens in one community, they share this list, and then people who live in another community who agree that those books should not be in the library anymore go to their community and remove those books as well. So the librarians from Westerly recently confronted legislation meant to restrict minors' access to certain types of books as proposed by House Rep. Samuel Azzanaro. So Brigitte and Bill, could you two recount the experience of that and why you felt so strongly that you had to oppose the potential bill?
All right, I got my timeline here. It's a good story. I'll get it started and then you can take over when things get really crazy. All right. On Wednesday, April 26th, we were contacted by Ed Garsha from Cranston Library, who informed me that the primary sponsor of Bill H6324 was a Westerly town representative, state representative. The bill happened to be introduced during Library Week, which was kind of ironic. And it seemed to be a reaction to another bill that Rhode Island's that the Legislative Action Committee had been supporting. That's H6066, which was attempting to seek protections for librarians, educators, museum workers, seeking to have those protections added to state obscenity laws, because we are the only state in New England who does not have that written into their obscenity laws. So that's something we had been striving for, and this seemed to be a reaction to that. Ed also asked that if Brigitte and I could talk to the sponsor of the bill. So on Friday, April 28th, we had a call with the sponsor, and we expressed all our concerns that this was added nothing to the existing bill. We'll only seek to single out certain types of materials and certain professions for punishment as a way to intimidate them. He was unswayed by anything we said, and he replied that he was only doing what his constituents wanted him to do. We replied that we are your constituents because we both live in town, and we are strongly opposed to this. He just said that we could come up and testify if it ever came out of committee. Then on Friday, June 2nd, Stephen Brown of the ACLU let Ryla know that the Westerly Town Council was considering a resolution in support of the bill. I guess they were looking to try and get this out of committee and thought that having various bodies of government around the state supporting it would help. Okay, so we immediately began to inform our staff, reach out to our friends group, community organizations, and the board of trustees.
So we knew we had a lot of supporters already, and knew that by contacting certain people, word would spread, and spread it did. So our friends group was actually meeting the Monday of our town council meeting and canceled their meeting to come and support us. And it was tremendous. Local school librarians, staff, trustees, community members, and even some that attended the meeting for a completely another reason spoke up in opposition of the bill. I believe there were over 20 people who got up and spoke. Yes. So there were 24 in total, 21 in opposition, 3 for it, and the 3 for it. It was an very interesting meeting. It is recorded, and there was a particular material that was singled out, and that was genderqueer, only reconfirming our suspicions behind the bill. But the amendment to an already existing bill, it added no value. Obscene materials are illegal. I mean, they just are. We can't buy obscene materials. You can't transport obscene materials. It was just silly to specifically call out, I think it said comic books and libraries, which libraries don't buy books, librarians do. So we took great offense to it. But thankfully, even though we don't feel that it even belonged at a town council meeting for them to consider and pass a resolution, it was rejected 4-2, with one counselor abstaining. Unfortunately, it also made it to our school committee agenda, but same result, it was rejected. It was a night where I was very disappointed in my representative, in some community members, but I was also really proud of everyone who came in support of all of our colorful community, our varied community. We have, we're Westerly, but we are diverse in so many ways. And librarians should really be celebrated for their work and not punished for it. Since intellectual freedom is the core value of our profession, basic right in our democratic society, we're here to serve the varying interests of every person in our community. And opposition to particular materials in libraries and interference with someone's freedom to read, or infringement on anyone's First Amendment rights is something that we will continue to fight for as long as we can.
And I think hearing about what went on in Westerly just reiterates how important it is for regular everyday people who love their library, who support their library, who love intellectual freedom and the free exchange of ideas to get involved when they hear something going on in their community. And like David said earlier, at the back table, there is a way that you can find more information about how you can do that.
If I could just add one thing. I think it is so important to go out and support libraries, especially when they're facing a challenge like this. We only heard about this at the last minute. I think it was trying to fly under the radar, and I'm not sure what would have happened if there hadn't been that public turnout, if we hadn't heard about it beforehand and showed up in force. It probably could have gone. Maybe that bill would have come out of committee, and maybe it would have gone somewhere on a state level. I don't know, but it was just so important that people came out and just raised a stink. It's really important to raise a stink with stuff like this.
All right. So continuing with the way that legal action can help us fight this trend in infringing on people's intellectual freedom rights. Steve, could you describe how the Rhode Island ACLU stands up to these laws and book bans and what the average citizen can do to protect their rights if and when they see one of these challenges in their community?
Sure. Well, one of the things that we try to do, and Westerly is a good example, is try to keep an eye on what's happening in the community. These often are under the radar, and it really is important to keep on top of efforts to do things, whether it's ban books, adopt resolutions to ban books, or whatever. We were fortunate in that we learned about this proposed town council resolution, and everybody was able to mobilize against it. But I think one of the things that all of you can do is just that. Keep an eye on what your city or town council and school committee are doing. Agendas need to be posted 48 hours in advance. They're online. And if you take the time to take a look at what's coming up, you can find these things that some city and town council people are hoping you don't see. But they're there if you look for them. And so, certainly one of our goals is to try to get that information out there when we find out about it. We spend time trying to educate individuals about their rights, including students, let them know what their rights are when it comes to censorship. Just last night, in recognition of Banned Books Week, we had an event here in Cranston at the William Hall Library where we had authors read from banned books. Again, as a way of, I think, sort of thumbing our nose at censors. One of the great things about censorship is how it creates the forbidden fruit. So often it only encourages people to reach out and see, what is all this fuss about? I want to read that book. And I think that's one of the positive things that comes out of banned books events like this. The way is really celebrating what the First Amendment is all about, notwithstanding all these efforts to engage in censorship. Obviously, if push came to shove, if there were a school district that began banning books based on their content or controversial nature, we are available to go into court. One of the major cases we would rely on is a case from the early 1980s. It's the only time the United States Supreme Court has ruled on this general issue of schools, library censorship. And they held that for the most part, schools cannot ban books based solely on their disagreement with the content of the books. The fascinating thing about that decision is there are two fascinating things. One is it's a good reminder that as bad as it is now, no matter what we're seeing, censorship in the schools has been going on ever since schools have existed. This was a 40-year-old case. And you look at some of the books that were banned in this school district, and you'll find them on censored reading lists now. So the beat goes on, but the ACLU is around and hopefully prepared to challenge any attempt at censorship that actually succeeds. Hopefully we don't get there. And if you do what you've just heard about, turn out at school committee meetings, city and town council meetings, and let them know your views, they're going to think twice. It's the best barrier to the passage of bad laws, to the use of censorship in libraries, either schools or public libraries, by coming out there, letting the people who make decisions know that you aren't going to take it.
So many of the books that end up on ALA's most common banned book list are focused on children. So I thought I would pose to the whole panel what it means to give people freedom to read, specifically children, and what is the benefits for them to exposing them to a plethora of perspectives through literature.
I'd like to use a quote that I used when I spoke in front of our Westerly Town Council. So in 1990, Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop coined the phrase windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors to explain how children see themselves in books and how they can also learn about the lives of others through literature. And when books don't serve as mirrors to children, they learn a powerful lesson about how they are devalued in society. Books can also serve as windows that give readers a glimpse into the lives and experiences of others. And they can also serve as sliding glass doors where readers can walk into a story and become part of the world created by the author, immersing themselves in another experience. And this is how our children form their own opinions and get exposed to something outside of their own world. I think windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, that is why the benefits of exposing children to something outside their world will allow them to grow and become productive members of society, because they can have empathy for others. And I think without that, I don't have as much hope for the future.
I just think, I always go back and think how things were when I was growing up, and diverse books, we didn't have them. We didn't have any sort of representation like that. Maybe one book in 100, 1,000 had any sort of race representation, and there was nothing as far as LGBTQ. And I just look around at the collections that public libraries are building now, and to me, it's very heartfelt. It fills me with joy because there's something for everyone there, and it just reinforces the opinion that we have to make sure that we defend that.
Yeah, it's difficult, I think, to improve on what the librarians are saying. I think you've pretty much captured it. I would just add one thing. you talk about the freedom to read, and as those of you who may have some legal training know, the fact that you have a right doesn't mean that the government has to provide you with the way to realize or effectuate that right. So you have a freedom to read. That doesn't mean the government has to go out and give you books for you to read. So that the way that this happens, the way that young people in particular are able to enjoy this right that they have, is through having access to a robust library that provides them with these materials. And I think that the enemies of the free society seem to understand that if you can somehow strike at the library, whether it's a school library or a public library, you can effectively choke off these young people's access to alternative points of view that could influence the way in which they see the world. And I think this gets into the issue of the benefits that you had asked about. What are the benefits for young people? They're demonstrable. I mean, the benefit is being able to review a lot of different viewpoints and have access to a diverse array of opinions so that you can find your own voice and you can find your own way of thinking about the world and your place in the world. And without the ability to see these alternative points of view, you will be robbed of the opportunity to even find yourself as a young person. I mean, when young people are at that age, they're so plastic and they're still developing, and they need to be able to ingest these intellectual nutrients so that they can develop a strong sense of self. And you can only do that by having access to a diverse array of sources, the exact things that are going to be choked off by these book bans.
The only thing I'd add is it's not only important for young people being able to find their own voice, it's allowing young people to understand other people's voices. Having a diverse collection of books that you read that aren't about you, that don't look like you, are really critical, I think, to helping promote empathy and understanding among young people as they're growing up, because they may live in communities where there aren't a lot of Black or Latino people or LGBTQ people who at least are out, and reading about it is extremely helpful. So you aren't just relying on rumors, and the things that, kids talk about in the playground about these things, but you're reading real things about real lives that you wouldn't otherwise ever reach an understanding about.
So, Professor Bryant, you might have some insight on this, but this question is for the whole panel, which is, why do we think or suspect that books specifically about the Holocaust frequently get targeted to be removed from schools or to have these challenges or bans happen?
Yeah. Again, I think you have to look at the material that is being banned, and the one that comes to mind for me, maybe for some of the other folks who are in attendance this evening, is the book by Art Spiegelman, Maus, which some of you may have read. My understanding is that the objection to Maus had something to do with nudity. True story, right? Apparently, there were some panels for those of you who may not know, but Maus is it's a graphic novel in which Art Spiegelman conceives of, or kind of reconceptualizes, the biographies of his parents who were Holocaust survivors, and sees them as mice. And of course, the SS then are cats, and he portrays this then as a device for trying to understand the Holocaust and the victimization of Jews in the 1940s. But this apparently was objectionable to people trying to remove Maus from library bookshelves because of several panels of naked mice, which is inherently absurd on its face. I mean, some of you are laughing, and justifiably so. When I first read it, I thought, my goodness, there are all kinds of things you could object to, maybe about a book, but naked mice? I mean, seriously? And the absurdity of it, I think, is quite telling. Because for me, what that reveals is that it's really not about the nudity, right? It's not about naked mice. What then is it about? And I'm perhaps stepping into into a potential trap here that I need to be careful about. Because as I said before, I'm very careful about extending the Nazi analogy to contemporary circumstances. And I don't for a moment believe that every person who wants to remove a book from a library is a Nazi or is sympathetic to the ideals of Nazism. Not at all. Not at all. I really think it's important to think clearly about what's going on in our country today. There are people of goodwill who I think they're misguided, but who nonetheless have embarked upon these projects. I do, however, think that the goal of creating a purified society, maybe a monolithic society in which a single viewpoint or a limited series of viewpoints receive the light of day, I think that does bear certain comparisons with the goal of Nazism, which was to create a folk national state in which a certain point of view and that point of view alone would exist, and everything else would be purged away. That's what the German Student Association said. They wanted to purify their society of those un-German elements, which is virtually anything that the Nazis didn't like. And so I think that some people who see these themes reflected in Holocaust literature, whether it's the Diary of Anne Frank, which has also been an object of attempts at suppression, or Maus, where it's very much in evidence. If you read the book, you will know of what I'm speaking. I think a lot of people are uncomfortable in seeing that some of their beliefs are reflected in the behavior of the Nazis. And the lengths to which this pernicious ideology can go, from war and persecution of minorities and mass murder and eventually genocide, as we all know. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that these people are brown in any way. By brown, I mean National Socialist brown. What I am suggesting is that they may see reflected in this literature perhaps beliefs that they themselves hold, and I think it's embarrassing for them. It's just a theory that I have. I don't know if it's right or not, but I really struggle to understand some of the justifications for suppressing Holocaust literature.
Are we at time? Okay, I think I'm going to skip one question then and do a final question. So we talked a lot about, I hate to phrase it as our viewpoint, but we talked a lot about the viewpoint of people who realize how harmful it is to suppress people's freedom to read. But I was wondering if the panel could talk about some common arguments that people who are trying to suppress these ideas have, who are trying to challenge books in schools and libraries, and maybe why they're problematic or misguided.
We're only trying to protect the children is a big one. I'm skeptical that is really the reason behind it. Let's take gender queer and what happened at our meeting in Westerly is the person who came and spoke most fervently in favor of the legislation had posters blown up of images taken out of context for that, and saying that this was a threat to children, as if this was going to be something that was going to be on elementary school bookshelves and not something in the high school. Again, and he talked a lot about the hypersexualization of children and so on. But again, they prove the lie when they then say, well, it's not just school libraries that we want this taken out of. It's public libraries too. And then they say, well, it's okay because you can still get it online or in a bookstore. So, but again, I think it's the material makes them uncomfortable, and I don't think they want anyone reading it, no matter how old they are.
I think, and we've heard over and over again, they're trying to protect our children. I think we did have a patron come in and even talk about a early reader, an easy reader Batman book, about why it
The least violent Batman book ever. It doesn't even throw a punch.
and the fact they didn't think it should be on the shelves in our kids' room because the parents get killed. And I think some people are afraid to have conversations. You know, I don't think we're doing our children, we're doing them a disservice if we're not having these conversations with them. So then we're by protecting them, we're putting them in this bubble. And I think in some ways, and I try to wrap my head around it and say, okay, these people are really coming from a good place, but you know, we do not ever act in lieu of parents. We do not take on that role. Librarians don't. And it's a parent's responsibility to decide what materials they should or should read. I have no problem with my children having access to materials because I know that we can have those discussions, and we do. But never should an individual or a group make sweeping decisions that takes away the choice of another reader. And I'd also like to add that, you know, as far as the protecting the children thing, it's not like, and the books that are challenged, they're not generally part of curricula. They're not anything that the students are being made to read. It's always something that is there if they choose to read it, which is, you know, in no way harmful. Sorry, genderqueer was actually challenged to be removed from the shelves of our high school, and it had never been checked out until the person brought it up at a public meeting, and they flew off our shelves, other shelves, the bookstore shelves. So again, you know, yes.
It became a runaway bestseller.
Again, yeah. Good book. It is, and even our librarians, they facilitated a book discussion with a number of women who just, you know, wanted to learn. They wanted to enlarge their, you know, their world by having those conversations. And again, having the conversations, they don't hurt anyone. They, you know, but
I guess to make the final point before you move to Q&A, the comments you made about what happened to genderqueer reminds me of one of my favorite anecdotes, and sort of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the forbidden fruit. Mark Twain was a great observer of human nature, and his book, Huckleberry Finn, has had its ups and downs over the years from people on all sides of the political spectrum. But I want to read to you a letter he wrote to his publisher in 1885. He said, the Committee of the Public Library of Concord, Massachusetts, have given us a rattling tip-top puff, which will go into every paper in the country. They have expelled Huck from their library as, quote, trash and suitable only for the slums, close quote. That will sell 20,000 copies for us, sure. So there you have it.
And I just, oh, sorry, do you have that?
Well, I would just, how can I improve on Mark Twain? I mean, my goodness. I just want to comment. The defense about children, right? And again, I don't want to suggest that every person who makes this argument is disingenuous, but I think there's a lot of disingenuousness among those who do make this argument. And if you listen to PEN America, or the American Library Association, they talk about what's going on today. 16% increase in efforts to remove books from public libraries, not just school libraries, but public libraries. And what they're finding is that the same people who were saying originally that they were only interested in the school libraries and protecting the poor little urchins, the poor little children and their delicate ears, that's all they're concerned about. Now they're moving on. Now that they've removed books, those books from the school libraries, they're going to the public libraries in order to remove the same books and similar books. You're trying to use the same argument, but ultimately depriving adults also of access to those books. And I think that's the point. It's not so much the kids that they're interested in. I think they want to get rid of these viewpoints altogether and prevent people from having access to them.
And I just wanted to add briefly, and I think we're kind of skirting around it. I think it is very related to the protecting the children, but I think another common argument is that a particular book is pornography. And pornography is something that we have very clear laws about. Steve can probably back me up because I'm sure your constitutional law knowledge and your Supreme Court case knowledge is better than mine. But there is the Miller test. There are things that we have put in place in order to judge what is pornographic and what isn't. And specifically in the Miller test is things having literary or artistic value. So just food for thought. So yeah, do we have time for questions? Does anyone have questions? Oh, yeah. Okay. Before you jump in, for our live stream audience, the question was asked. The question asker made a point about there being procedures in place for when people want to put into question whether something should be in the library collection, and have we seen books go missing, disappear, be stolen, so as a way to try to prevent people from taking them out. Go ahead. Oh, okay.
Well, actually, the day of the town council meeting, one of the people in favor of that resolution came into the library and went to the children's room where there were some pride displays and checked out a bunch of materials and left a note saying that he would not return those materials until we took down pride displays throughout the library. Eventually, his books were due and he returned them. We had taken down the pride displays because Pride Month was over. It had nothing to do with his letter, but maybe he felt he had a little victory. We didn't really feel like engaging, since it would have it seemed like he wanted to pick a fight. And so we were just going to ignore him and buy new books.
And in fact, a number of school librarians pulled their funds together and bought us a box of books for our collection. And there's lots of things that people do. Sometimes I'm not sure if they're actually wanting the books and a little embarrassed about checking out books. I have seen people turn the books around so that we can't see their spines. They'll misshelve them. Not so much stealing.
I also just quickly have a fun anecdote of one of the previous libraries I worked at. They were like, our Wicca books are always missing. So, yeah, whether it was that people were embarrassed that they wanted books about Wicca, or whether people in the community were upset about Wicca, the Wicca books always walked away.
Larcenous witches.
books about the religion of Wicca, which is like, witchcraft people who believe in spells and magic as part of their religion, rituals, things like that. All right, I saw other hands. Did you have a question?
Discusses the change in 18th, 17th century Europe as people became less afraid of other groups around them. And he traces it to the growth of the novel. And people, for the first time, had access to folks outside of their own community to learn about the lives of other people. And I suspect that may be at the root of why so many people are so afraid of so many books. That their children will read and not be afraid of the same things they're afraid of.
All right, how do I summarize that comment? Steven Pinker, is that his name? Yeah. So in his research, he had found that seems like you said 17th, 18th century, so like Enlightenment period and the rise of the novel being the reason that we saw a decrease in that period of fear of the quote unquote other. All right. Are there any more questions?
Could I make just a comment? Yeah, it's a really interesting point that you're making, and a similar argument has been made that novel reading, writing, and reading may have also led to the rise of human rights and people's interest in defending the concept of human rights and the human dignity of people because of this elicitation of greater compassion for people from foreign cultures or different cultures. So it may actually have led, I think of Len Hunt in particular has made this argument, and some others, that novel reading led in that direction as well.
My question is something I'm grappling with, addresses the library as a public space rather than a place to borrow books. Not that long ago, one of our branches hosted a seemingly benign organization, like Ladies Who something or other. And it turned out it became known to the community that they were anti-trans and queer. And so the community came out. And in that moment, it was the library that was blamed for the circumstance, whereas anyone can rent a room in the library. And so I'm grappling with this myself, and I'd love to hear the panel's idea of how do you, a library promote free speech, yet maybe in a tangential way foment things that are against free speech and expression.
So the question was asked about, so we talked a lot about books, but also libraries are public spaces where we sometimes allow people to use our space, sometimes for a small fee, sometimes for free. And we don't always have control of what that event is going to be about, what the ideology of the people coming in is about, and basically kind of like how we grapple with being a supportive member of the community and not infringing on other people's rights to use the library.
I think you can be supportive of the community only if you support free speech for everybody. I think it's really that simple. If you start picking and choosing, you are no different than the people who want these particular books taken out of the library. In this instance, the library was open as a public forum. Anybody could make use of it. They did. People who strongly objected, they protested outside the library. They exercised their own free speech. The ACLU's argument for decades has been the answer to bad speech is more good speech. It's not to suppress the speech you don't like. You very quickly go down a very bad rabbit hole when you start saying, well, these people are bad to the community, are promoting these bad ideas to the community. The people who want to ban genderqueer feel exactly the same way. So I was proud of how the library reacted to that. let it go on, and tried to educate the community about why it was important to be neutral and allow the library as a neutral public forum.
We had the same group come to Westerly Library. We had this same issue, but they had to be given that opportunity because we do allow our spaces to be used by all. So they were perfectly within their rights to book a room and do their own private event. Honestly, we were like, oh, really? Now we have to deal with this? Because we knew there would be negative press. We knew there would be feelings of, why, questions about why are you allowing this? Because we have to, because we don't tell people what they can and cannot believe. And it doesn't matter whether or not we approve of those viewpoints. They have as much right to use the space as anyone else. And we had a lot of conversations with our staff, not all of whom, some of who were very upset by the viewpoints of that group. But I think eventually, at least most people understood the reason why we allowed it.
Yeah. I agree with everything that's being said here. I'm a John Stuart Mill liberal when it comes to this sort of thing. The free marketplace of ideas is such that it really has to be untrammeled. And when we start establishing orthodoxy and excluding certain points of view, that's the road to perdition, it seems to me. But can I complicate things a little fruitfully? At least I hope it's fruitful. I teach German law to graduate and undergraduate students. The Germans have a very, very different approach to this question. Because of their experience, their historical experience, they've developed a doctrine under law. Maybe some of you are familiar with the fighting democracy idea, wehrhafte Demokratie in German, the militant democracy. So you probably know, and if you don't, this is an interesting fact, that in Germany, it's illegal to espouse Nazi ideas. And not just in Germany, also in Canada, so far as I know. Similar laws are in place. France, I think in most of Western Europe, it is illegal to espouse such ideas. Mein Kampf was illegal. It was illegal to publish Mein Kampf up until 2016, when there was an exception made, and then the book was finally reissued since the 1940s. And the German perspective, it's interesting. It's not necessarily something that a lot of Americans agree with. And when I teach the subject to American students, they typically don't agree with it. But then we look at some of their case law. I talk about their history, and I talk about why the Germans made this decision in the 1950s to make both communist publications and Nazi publications illegal in Germany. And by the end of the 2 or 3 weeks in which we talk about this topic, some of the students have not exactly changed their minds, but they're wavering a little bit. They begin to understand the German point of view, that liberalism has to draw a line at some point. And according to this German approach, you cannot allow those who would destroy democratic governance and destroy the very conditions for pluralistic government. They cannot be allowed to do that. I mean, Goebbels himself said in 1924, we will use the Weimar Republic's freedoms as a way to destroy the Weimar Republic. And that's exactly what the Nazis did. Does democracy have a role? Does it have some authority? Does it have a justification for perhaps drawing a line at some point and declaring that some kinds of speech is so pernicious, so demonstrably harmful that it should not be allowed? Now, I've not made that step myself with my own concepts of jurisprudence, but I am not unsympathetic to where the Germans stand here. There is an argument that can be made that there are certain types of speech that are so inherently evil and so inflammatory and so destructive and have been proven to be so in history that democracy cannot tolerate it, because it is an existential threat to the existence of pluralistic society and of democracy itself. So I only mention that as a way to complicate what we've been talking about.
It's not complicated for me, I'll be honest. I mean, I do understand, Germany has a history, and they're Germany. We are the United States that has had a Bill of Rights from almost its beginning and made freedom of speech the first among its amendments. But, you mentioned that it was a ban on both Nazism and communism. And we tried to deal with communism in the 1950s, and we know how that worked. So I think there's a lesson from our own history about the dangers of giving government, because ultimately it's the government that's going to decide what is approved, what is not approved, what is allowed and what is not. And whether you think it's communism, Nazism, genderqueer, anything else, we're going to have to rely on the government ultimately to make those decisions, and they may not be the decisions that we end up wanting to see.
All right, do we have any more questions? Okay. Thank you all for joining us.